The other day, the yellow pages were delivered to my house and my daughter was excited that a package had come, so we were looking through it. And in the middle of it, they have maps like the old street directories that we used. And it was funny to look and use one of them for the first time where, go up to page 36, go across to page 29. And it was helpful because I actually got to see how a lot of the area I live in fits together. Because when I just use my phone to get me from place to place, it really only shows you the small little part of the road that you are on. But to get this fuller vision of the area that I'm living, where suburbs and lakes and beaches intersect with one another, was really helpful. My guest today offers the idea that doctrine, Christian doctrine, provides something of this kind of vision. That it works together, parts and the whole, to constructively and creatively present a vision of what the Christian gospel proclaims and a vision of the kind of world in which it is proclaimed. My guest today is Geoff Thompson, longtime friend of the podcast, the wonderful Geoff Thompson, the coordinator of studies of systematic theology at Pilgrim Theological College and associate professor at the University of Divinity, Melbourne, Australia. His book is Christian Doctrine, A Guide for the Perplexed, which is out now with T&T Clark. I encourage you to go and get it, and you can check out his other books, Disturbing Much, Disturbing Many, A Genuinely Theological Church, and I think it's in his own strange way, his sort of commentary on the basis of union. And there's more ways to connect with Geoff in the show notes. But for now, my name is Liam Miller, which I think I've forgotten in the last bunch of interviews. This is Love, Rinse, Repeat, another fact I often forget. But let us welcome Geoff Thompson to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Well, Geoff Thompson, welcome back to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you, Liam. It's good to be back.
Yeah, I've had you on several times now, it's really exciting and always fun to talk with you. Where this is going to come out pretty soon after we record, so we're recording, in the midst of COVID-19 and all its effects. You were just saying you're teaching online now, like the classes have moved online, and church worship's been suspended here. So hopefully this conversation will, help people fill time or fill their lack of Bible study or theological conversations that they are missing out on.
Well, maybe. I mean, I'm struck that probably reading books on Christian doctrine isn't the way that most people would fill their time in these present circumstances. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of understandings of Christianity that are coming into play and need some development, interrogation, enhancement right at the moment, precisely because of the circumstances we're in. So maybe the book could be quite useful at this time.
There we go. Maybe as we get into this conversation, we'll see how. So I guess maybe it is kind of, you almost kind of flagged it a bit there. Doctrine isn't necessarily the first thing a theologian thinks that they want to explore, especially doctrine as a broader field, not individual doctrines. And probably in the churches even less. You kind of mention early on in the preface that doctrine is sometimes met with furrowed brows and quite active avoidance. So what was it that drew you to explore doctrine as this as a fuller concept and its role in the church and its relationship to the Bible?
Well, I think the realization that we are working with it all the time, whether we acknowledge it or not, or whether we are more or less generous towards doctrine. Doctrine is just there. We are the inheritors of a particular tradition, and people are developing doctrine all the time. They're using it, and in the process of using it, are developing it. That's one reason. The second reason is just my interest, I suppose, in a debate that began back in the 1980s through George Lindbeck's The Nature of Doctrine. And I've followed that debate over the intervening decades, and I've found it just to be a really lively debate about what is doctrine, what function does it have in the life of the church, and I think, unfortunately, the liveliness of that debate has actually not really touched the churches. So some of those negative attitudes towards doctrine remain in place without any awareness of how much vibrancy there actually is, and ferment, if you like, around the question of doctrine in scholarly discussions. So there was the coming together of those two things, I guess, that thought I could explore this and try and give an overview of what doctrine is and how it functions in the life of the church.
So you've been, even before these books come out, you've been kind of teaching courses on doctrine. I did a couple of courses with you that one was very much on doctrine, and another one, it was part of the broader sweep of the class. What was it like, delivering these classes, both, I guess, in the lead up to coming to the book and in the process of writing it? Did it shape the questions? Did it direct where or what you wanted to focus on as you developed it? How was that process for filling out your thought on this topic?
Well, I think probably both in the promotion of those courses and in the initial atmosphere of the classroom in those courses, I was reminded of the, if not negativity, the suspicion that exists towards the whole doctrinal enterprise, even to the very word. So in a sense, that was good. I get reminded of those realities that are there the moment you want to start creatively engaging with doctrine, let alone run a unit on it. But I think what those courses have also reminded me, and I hope I've conveyed that to the students who've done them, is that the doctrine is an area of tremendous intellectual creativity. Yes, and the reason why there is suspicion and negativity towards doctrine is because it can't be denied. Doctrine has often been imposed authoritatively on individuals and on communities and the church as a whole. And so, for that, it rightly gets a negative rap for that reason. But I think at the same time, when you actually look at the history of doctrine, you actually see how much ferment it carries along within it, and how much doctrine actually becomes the focus of intellectual creativity. It becomes the focus of prayer, of liturgy. It's a very fertile part of the church's life, and its life and thought. So I guess, on the one hand, running those courses has reminded me of what you're up against when you try to creatively engage doctrine. But there've been occasions when I've been reminded of the fruitfulness of Christian doctrine.
I guess maybe I want to jump, this is like further into the book, but it's just maybe a good case study of what you're talking about here, in case people are still skeptical of the usefulness of particularly, doctrinal statements of a sort. Yes. And you look in part of the book at the Belhar Confession in South Africa as an example where doctrinal work produced by the church, in an attempt to assert a powerful truth claim, has, instead of dividing, united and really become a kind of constructive political and theological statement in a time when it was of great need. Yes. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that and how you see that as an example of of the function of doctrine in this kind of constructive, creative, life-giving manner?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's almost the best example there is in recent decades of doctrine doing serious work and employing very orthodox Christian doctrine as well, and using a genre that we might associate with the 16th century from the Reformers. So I think it just beautifully demonstrates, I think, how doctrine works. And again, just those who are not familiar with it, it comes out of the 1980s in South Africa, in the context of a divided church, the racially divided church. And this comes as a powerful statement about essentially the doctrine of reconciliation. And it's making the point that if indeed reconciliation is or God's reconciliation of the world is what it is according to the biblical witness, and if it does indeed have these implications for the forms of life that must be demonstrated amongst Christian people, then the divisions that had existed on the basis of race in South Africa were to be utterly rejected. So, and then it became part then of the political protest, but it also became part of the protest within the South African Christian community. I think one of the things that's really striking about that document, the Belhar Confession, is that it never, in the body of the confession itself, it never actually mentions South Africa, or it never uses the word apartheid. Now, there is an accompanying letter that, in a sense, is part of the confession, but it is distinct, and that accompanying letter does set out the context of the document. But I think it's one of the reasons why it has resonance today, and why there are churches around the world who have taken up this confession themselves, even though they've not been part of South Africa in the 1980s or in contexts that are not necessarily troubled by racial division. It's because it's tapped deeply into what the gospel is. It's probed right down to the heart of what this gospel of reconciliation is. And it has declared this in a very strong, bold, declaratory pronouncement. This is the gospel, and these are the implications of the gospel. Does so focused on one particular doctrine, although it spills out into other areas of Christian doctrine as well. So yeah, I think it's a great place to start, and both to essentially just to demonstrate what doctrine is, the forms that it takes, the context in which it arises, and the functions that it can perform.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think
Can I just say, if people
yeah.
haven't, I hope lots of people buy the book, but if you don't buy the book, go and look up Belhar Confession on the internet. I mean, it's a really wonderful document.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think something that I guess another point, which the story of the Belhar kind of points to this, is that we often think, I think there's a perception that doctrine kind of happened once and happened for all, and we've all just kind of got to get in line with what was decided in pretty much the 3rd and 4th century, and you have to at least assent to it, even if you want to cross your fingers. You got to at least kind of just abide by these once and for all. But what you kind of point out, drawing on a range of theologians, is that doctrine is revisable. Doctrine is produced, and exists within debates, and is grounded in conflicts and contest, and but is this process that's not fixed? Is this thing that we come to again and again to revise and to re-explore? Do you want to talk a little bit about how you coming to that idea of doctrine, and how potentially that is good news to a church moving into new times and places?
Yeah. Well, I think chapter 2 of the book, where I set out the 10 different theologians who are self-consciously doctrinal theologians, and most of them, with one exception, working in a kind of producing their material in a systematic way. What that survey of those 10 theologians show, I think, is as a historical fact, that Christian theologians never simply repeat what they have received. I mean, obviously, yes, there are some who do that, and still today. But when you look at the great theologians, they see themselves, on the one hand, yes, there is something to receive, and depending on their own relationship to the tradition, their own ecclesiology, their own ecclesial position as individuals, they will receive the doctrinal tradition with a greater or lesser degree of loyalty. But none of them simply repeat it. They develop it, they ask new questions of it. Sometimes, yes, they will simply expound what has been given. But that's really only a small part of what they do. So they are representing the Christian gospel, mediated by its doctrinal framework and doctrinal content, to a particular context that's asking particular questions, that's facing particular pressures. So, I mean, that's I think just very clear from the historical record when you look at the history of doctrinal theologians doing their work. Now, sure, you could argue, and certainly in the 10 that I used, there is some continuity of broad framework. There is a conviction about the unity of creation and redemption, the pivotal place of Jesus Christ in that unity. But beyond that, they address that overarching framework in a multitude of ways. And the way they reassemble Christian doctrine is also part of what they don't simply repeat. That's where their creativity is often most evident, when they are the ways in which they order Christian doctrine, whether they start with the doctrine of God or doctrine of salvation or scripture, for instance. And that, I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the whole history of doctrinal theologians. I think the other powerful witness to that phenomenon about doctrine is the work of Christine Helmer and her analysis of how doctrine is developed and constructed. But she just says it's unavoidable that Christian doctrine just is produced in the midst of debate, of crisis, of controversy, and I would add it's also produced at times of stability and times of consolidation, and it's produced in the context of prayer and liturgy and worship. But it always involves people discussing with one another, whether literally face-to-face or in councils or through scholars engaging with their predecessors in their writings. It simply can't be denied that doctrine is this kind of socially constructed phenomenon.
Thank you for that. And I think I was a book. People can check out the interview of Christine Helmer as well, on the Love, Rinse, Repeat feeds if you want more of that. And I agree with Geoff. Her work is really great. I was recently reading B.A. Gerish's Christian Faith Dogmatics in Outline, and it just kind of goes to your point of he's very much someone entrenched in a tradition.
Yes.
And he picks two kind of voices to have a conversation with in Calvin and Schleiermacher and taking that Reformed tradition. But he himself is, critiquing and rereading and reading against them and reading through them and bringing in other voices. But it's still something grounded in tradition, but it is this, conversation across time in different contexts in order to, explore all these various doctrinal points. So I think,
and I think that's what makes this kind of, and whether it's doctrine or other forms of theological or more general intellectual work, interesting. It's actually when you watch one great thinker engage another great thinker, both in appreciation and criticism. That, to my mind, is much, much more interesting than just someone who comes up with a set of new ideas and expounds them for the heck of it. Because it's actually there where you see real thought, real development of ideas, and real intellectual power on display. And I think they should all be features of what is good Christian doctrine.
And then I guess there's the idea of, so that's the doctrine in its production, and then it becomes about, in its reception. And you kind of talk here in one point, Christian doctrine is an intellectual enterprise that generates further investigation, clarification, criticism, commentary, and construction. So it's not only about, Bart can write all this he wants, and then it has to go out into the world, and people have to then wrestle with, well, are we going to take this on or not? Or how is it going to shape our churches and our meetings? And I think that's where it's interesting in your opening definition that you work with. You talk about Christian doctrine being communally recognized. So again, it's not, there's kind of two things at play here. One, it can't just be individually espoused and then not picked up, then it has no doctrinal power. And also it can't just be individually espoused and then enforced, or assumed to be the way. So talk a bit, I guess, about the way that after production, going into then that conversation, contemplation, wrestling in a community, and why it was important for you to see both that this is that fertile ground continues post-production, and how that then gets to this idea of being communally recognized.
Sure. Well, now that you've mentioned Bart, I will just, one of my favorite quotes from Bart, and it's one of my favorite quotes in the book, is that, Bart uses the word dogmatics in this particular quotation. He said, all dogmatics is fluid material for further work. And I think that's, again, it challenges some of the stereotypes that doctrine has. And it also challenges the way many doctrinal theologians, or the way some doctrinal theologians work. I think that idea of it being fluid material is foreign to some doctrinal theologians. If I can also just pick up that issue about defining doctrine as communally recognised teaching, for me, the choice of the word recognised there was quite important, because it allows people to be part of a community who recognise that this particular doctrine is what a community teaches. But they may dissent from it, but that alone doesn't mean that they can't be part of the community. And I think dissent is, again, an important part of the Christian community, and again, something that I think has not been often enough brought into conversation with what Christian doctrine is, which of course does lead into the question of how it is received. And I guess the argument that I've developed in the book is to talk about the role that doctrine plays in the Christian social imaginary. That its role is often implicit. In fact, mostly, probably the vast majority of the work that Christian doctrine does for the Christian community is implicit. And I don't think that, to me, is not a problem at all. I don't think it is the purpose of Christian doctrine to find its work in its replication in each individual believer. I don't think every individual believer has to be on top of every Christian doctrine or even have an awareness of it. But I think that Christian doctrine, because the way in which particular theologians put the different doctrines together itself produces a vision of what the Christian faith is, and therefore a vision of what the world is, what reality is, and how we engage it and experience reality and enter into it and change it, challenge it through the filter of that Christian vision. So, but that's going. How does that happen? Well, obviously, it's going to happen in a multitude of ways. It will happen through preaching, it'll happen through teaching in the faith, happen through people reading the Bible from in a doctrinally informed way. But as I say, I think a lot of that just happens at a very implicit level, and I think that is absolutely fine. But I think that nevertheless means that there need to be some people in the church who are conscious and deliberate and intentional about the work that doctrine can do, alert also to the way it can be misformed, and therefore the damage it can actually do to the Christian social imaginary. But that doesn't mean everybody has to be engaged with doctrine in the same way. But the church as a community ought to be intentional about some of its members at least being attentive to its work.
Thank you for that. I think it's probably worthwhile then, Senna, that you've been talking about social imaginary, and that obviously becomes a big part of the penultimate chapter of the book, is doctrine's role in shaping this Christian social imaginary. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're meaning when using that term,
Sure.
for those who haven't encountered it before or heard it in passing, and then maybe we'll get into a bit of the gritty of how doctrine works in there.
Sure, yeah. Well, look, it's a term that's used in a number of disciplines, perhaps particularly in political theory. And I use it as it's developed by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. So for Taylor, the social imaginary is that sort of innate or inchoate or implicit sense of what holds a community together. What allows members of one community to recognise another person as a member of that community? How does it help them? The social imaginary is that the implicit, almost invisible reality that allows people to determine what their shared values are, to recognise what might be outside those values, and in a sense, it is something of the glue that holds a particular given community together. And I think I've tried. I think that therefore is a useful concept for thinking about the church. I mean, what is it that holds the Christian community globally together, or what holds a particular tradition together, or a particular local church community together? So I think it's a helpful concept. And part of Taylor's point is that you don't necessarily have the social imaginary set out. There aren't particularly written documents that tell you what they are. Those written documents might be there performing certain functions within that society, but their influence on forming the social imaginary is, well, I keep using the word implicit, but that's essentially what it is. So, but of course, there are many different realities within a society that are forming its social imaginary. In a political society, it might be its laws, it might be a constitution, might be the laws, the parliamentary processes themselves, or government processes. So no one of them defines the social imaginary. And that's why I think it's a helpful concept to bring into the conversation about doctrine. I think doctrine can be presented as one of the things that helps form the Christian social imaginary, that sense of who we are, what do we value, what do we recognize amongst each other, what do we want to affirm about that which even lies outside of our particular society, what can we absorb from other societies. So I think doctrine is able to do that alongside other things that the church does in forming the church's collective social imaginary. And I think for those who perhaps are worried about doctrine and its notion, its association with being imposed authoritatively, I think placing doctrine as one of the important, but not the only source of the Christian imaginary, and seeing it do, if you like, a more gentle sort of work than doctrine had perhaps sometimes done in its more authoritative and enforced manifestations, might be helpful for people to see, actually, doctrine is important, but let's use it and develop it and engage with it in the way that it allows it to do its gentle work.
I think that's really helpful. And I think, you can see that there's then a pastoral role to doctrine as well. I'm thinking about, like, at the moment, right, churches can't meet together.
Yeah.
Can't meet in the buildings they have been, for some people, meeting in for decades and decades and decades. And that's challenging a lot of people's conception of what the church is. Because, as you say, not a lot of people have engaged all manner of ecclesiology, which might remind you again and again, the church is not a building, but the people. But, so now, doctrine has a kind of a role to play in helping to frame a picture of what it is to be the church, what it is to be, a Christian social imaginary, a corporate body of people that can't come together, but is still just as valid if it meets online. And obviously there's lots of discussions out there, particularly maybe churches with higher sacramental theologies about how exactly, they're going to do all this. And yes, this actual attention to the way doctrine can shape how we understand ourselves is very pastorally important in times like this, where people maybe are feeling that the meaning is being ripped away, and validity of their faithfulness is being shaken.
Yeah, and I think our present circumstances are going to have a very significant impact on the Christian social imaginary for all the reasons you just talked about. We've all affirmed for ages that the church is the people, it's not the building. But in practice, we find it very hard to let go of that. And I think this could be a very good opportunity to think very deeply about the nature of the church. I agree.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about another specific example in the book, because one of the critiques or questions that sometimes also gets laid at the foot of people interested in doctrine is that, particularly, if you take a view of there are guiding doctrines that the whole church must attend to, particularly that coming from Chalcedon and Nicaea, and that is that the questions being asked about substance and nature are totally foreign to the questions being asked in non-Western cultures and theologies and churches in the contemporary time. And so that doctrine kind of falls apart, or the concept of what doctrine tries to do receives great challenge or falls apart as Christianity crosses cultures. And you address that in a couple of different ways. And one is through engaging M.M. Thomas, an Indian theologian, to show that in a wildly different context, in post-independence India, or in the process of getting independence, post-independence India, and dealing with mass poverty and being a minority group within the culture, all these different questions that were not the questions of 4th century Rome, he still approaches them through attending to doctrine.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe I'm putting the broader question out about that kind of concern about doctrine as Christianity crosses cultures and different questions and cultural frameworks and language emerges, and also and then into this particular case of what Thomas attempts and achieves.
Sure. Well, in many ways, I think the example I give of M.M. Thomas and the 2 Chinese theologians that I engage with as well actually confirm the point made in the earlier chapters about the dynamic nature of Christian doctrine. But this mixture of receiving something and deeming it worthy enough to consider engaging it, even if it is in criticism, but actually seeing there's something here that's been received that is actually worth wrestling with. And Thomas does that particularly with the doctrine of salvation, in a context in which the life reality, and this is mid 20th century India emerging, as you said, emerging into its independent state. But what he's able to do is to take some broad brush view of the Christian view of salvation, centered in Jesus Christ, and take that into the realities of caste, of poverty, shocking inequality in India, and make that doctrine come alive in a particular context, his own context. But I also think one of the things that drew me to focus on Thomas's work, or I suppose this is just another way of making the same point, is that he doesn't see himself as a complete innovator. He sees himself radically engaging the Christian doctrine of salvation, and knowing that in what he argues about it, basically he talks, and people get nervous about the Marxist overtones of his work, of humanization. But he develops it in such a way that he never loses the roots. He never loses his roots in the Christian doctrine of salvation. And that he develops it in a way that means that other people who are part of what he's receiving, or who are more used to the sort of traditional doctrine of salvation that he's receiving, can engage with it. So that I think he opens up the possibility of real communication across those different cultural contexts around that particular Christian doctrine. Both the 2 Chinese theologians, K.H. Ting and Wang Wei Fan, they have an almost identical approach. Wang Wei Fan, in his doctrine of the cosmic Christ, says he wants to develop this in a way that it actually could be a blessing for the Western Church, which I think shows the kind of this posture of engagement with doctrine that is both, and again, to quote Kevin Van Hooser's comments that I always already quote in the book, doctrine inhabits this space between stabilization and innovation. And I think that the cross-cultural contexts that cluster of mid-20th century Asian theologians that I talk about, and some that I've referred to later in the book, I think are brilliantly focusing for us what it means to inhabit this space precisely in matters of Christian doctrine, between stabilization and innovation.
That's really helpful. I wonder if there's some lesson for preachers there as you're trying to introduce new concepts, or to try to motivate a community to become passionate about a particular thing in their neighborhoods or society, of embedding that in familiar language and concepts of doctrine and theology.
Yes, definitely.
So there's a conversation through the book, that comes up again and again of doctrine of both the part and the whole, and that a lot of time doctrine exists within systems that try to, as you say, I think you mentioned earlier, try to present a vision of the faith and a vision of seeing the world, and for that reason the pieces should relate in some way or another, one way or another. And you kind of, another point talk about, there isn't doctrine without doctrines as well. Like in the end comes to a point where people are wrestling with specific truth claims about the faith. So I guess maybe just talk to us a bit about that, because again, I think that's probably, if you're working in churches, sometimes, and you're getting little pieces of lectionary texts here and there, and you're trying to present this Christian, help foster a social imaginary, and you're trying to help people understand in parts, the fullness of the Christian confession. How do you see that relationship between part and whole, and how that we might explore that without overburdening ourselves, that what I preached 4 years ago on Genesis 1 needs to really line up with what I'm about to say on John 1.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful I find it helpful anyway to be very intentional about using the word vision instead of system. And I think that there's been a very long debate, particularly in 20th century doctrinal theology, about the importance or not of a system, and certainly feminist critique has been very strong, and justly so, in this area, that too much Christian doctrine has been presented as a final system. Again, I think the historical record suggests it's something more subtle than that, but one can't deny that there are particular church traditions and particular theologians who do indeed produce this system of thought that's closed, that's final, and there can be no engagement, creative engagement with it. So it's right to criticise that. But I think there's two reasons we might look at, or there are two different dimensions, I think, to the question of system. On the one hand, it's a very modern issue, in the sense that some Christian theologians sought to develop systems of thought to give them epistemological security in the context of post-Enlightenment Western thought. So if Christian thought was going to be defended and articulated, it needed some foundation, and from that foundation you build up a system. Pull the foundation away and the system actually collapses. So I think it's absolutely right to criticise that view, because you can't, we'll talk about at the end of the book what exactly is the foundation of, or what is the foundation of our truth claims. So there's a whole lot of postmodern critique of Christian thought feeding that particular criticism. But I think when you look at the pre-modern era, before this desire for epistemological foundations kicked in, people were quite happy to develop systems of thought. They may not have used that word, but some sense of the whole, but they were driven not to secure its foundations, but to actually address the pastoral and pedagogical needs of the Christian community. The sense in which we can provide a vision. It is possible to articulate the Christian faith in such a way that allows us to see reality, life, the world through this particular filter. So I think that's okay, but I think it's unhelpful to use the word system for that. We can use the word vision for that. In terms then of how does that happen, particularly for preachers, well, I don't know that the lectionary is our best friend in that regard, partly because of the way that it tends to atomize scripture. It tends also to already have built into it particular themes that may be okay, but not necessarily providing opportunities for unpacking some of those themes through a more creative engagement. Of course, I'm sure many preachers do that. But look, I think in the end, it's about preachers finding ways of making the connections. And I think being intentional about that. When I used to be involved in teaching, preaching in an earlier placement, I used to say that the issue for me is not what are you going to communicate in this sermon today. but what vision of life are you going to be cultivating amongst your congregation over the next year? And which I think takes the pressure off needing to get this sermon right, or to be preoccupied with conveying information, pieces of information X, Y, and Z in this sermon, but thinking about how does this sermon relate to what I'm doing in the whole ministry of preaching over a year or 2 years. I don't know whether that is works or not. I mean, it was something I tried to do when I was in parish ministry, but that's a fair while ago now.
No, I think that's a really good way to think about it. I was just thinking, when you're talking then about that shift in the way doctrine was constructed, to answer those post-enlightenment critiques. One of the things I remember learning in one of your classes that's always stuck with me is the way the shift in ordering of doctrine has a marked and noticeable change in the kind of post-Reformation time, where the doctrine of Scripture creeps ever and ever higher and ends up being predominantly the opening confession. Is about the assurity, the assuredness of God's word in the Bible, and how that then creeps into our culture, and that so many church websites or denominational statements open with the "what we believe" section, and the first thing is we believe God's word, we believe the Bible, and that's kind of as you say, is trying to create an epistemological foundation that. Is meant to safeguard the beliefs, but really it then just detaches the Bible from the whole story of salvation and the nature of God as one who reveals. And so I think this is again a good case for why it's important to kind of have done some thought on this doctrine and the way it has been developed in contest and negotiation, and to answer particular questions in particular times and places. Because when not, then it just kind of trickles down to we're all just doing this because that's what we think we need to start with, but it starts to potentially malform the vision.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's another very good example of thinking about the way that this tension between stabilization and innovation. You could argue that the reformers had good reasons to bring Scripture forward the way they did, but then it stabilizes. And it takes on a life of its own that is divorced from the polemics of the 16th, 17th centuries, and is no longer actually addressing the question that the reformers may have been addressing themselves when they encouraged it to be lifted higher up. Now, I do need to say, of course, if you look at John Calvin, the great, the most systematic perhaps of all the early reformers, he didn't actually begin with Scripture. I mean, yes, he begins with Revelation, but it's a much broader concept of the knowledge of God and the knowledge of God in ourselves, which he holds together. So, yes, it's another example of the diversity with which different theologians actually respond to different, or to respond to similar challenges.
So then, just as a fun question, because we're nearing the end, I remember you asking this of the students when we were doing this class, given, there's no right way to begin a system or a vision, where would you, if you were sitting down to write your comprehensive and cohesive vision of the Christian life, where do you begin?
Yeah, well, I've been wrestling with this just these last few weeks in teaching Christianity's big ideas this semester. And I guess the last few years I've been starting with Christology. And I think that's probably, again, but that's where my instinct lies, to start there. Because it seems to me without Christology and all the disruptions that Christology bears within it, both the production of Christology itself as a way of thinking about God and this strangeness of this crucified man being identified with God. You take that away, you take away that disruption, and so many of the other questions that Christian theology wrestles with also fall away. And if you begin elsewhere, there's always the risk, I think, and it doesn't necessarily have to be realized. The risk doesn't need to be realized, but it can be. That if you start elsewhere, you'll allow those questions or allow those areas of doctrinal inquiry to separate themselves from that fundamentally disruptive moment that Christology brings about.
I like it. You reveal yourself as a good student of the basis of union in that approach. And I think also, just as we won't give away the farm, but if people are heading to the book, there's a lot of discussion around the relationship between doctrine and truth, which has a whole own conversation where you get into Lynn Beckenbach, who's a Helmer. But at the end, that answer maybe reveals a little bit about where you go looking for the relationship between doctrine and truth, which I think is a helpful step that you make in the book.
Yeah, frustrated that the word limit prevented me from saying much more at the end of the book. I really did run out of words there, or allowable words.
Sure.
Because I would have liked to have said a lot more, but anyway, there it is.
Well, maybe we'll get you on sometime and we can, do a second epilogue audio version style. Let's plug out the book. It is Christian Doctrine, A Guide for the Perplexed, an excellent series with lots of other great primers, but this is the one you need to get first with T&T Clark. Geoff, thank you for coming on. Is there anything else you want to promote? And people might be looking for online classes. You got anything coming up next semester, or is it all just play it by ear?
Oh, well, I'm on study leave next semester, so I'm looking forward to doing a bit of writing. Nice. But again, there's one thing I wanted to follow up, and that is at some point this was rattling around my head as we were discussing, in terms of coming back to the purpose of Christian doctrine and that discussion about this social imaginary. And I talked about the need for the church to at least be intentional that some of its people are addressing this. I think that what could be between those who will never have an explicit knowledge of Christian doctrine and don't need to have it, and those that do and who are charged by the church to do so. Then in between there, I think there are people who will have some awareness of the theological and doctrinal tradition in an explicit way, but not necessarily, that's not their vocation. But I think the role that doctrine plays for them is to help develop good theological instincts and intuitions. And I owe that phrase and that metaphor, if you like, of the theological instincts and intuitions to a colleague. I don't think she'll mind me saying so, Rachel Kronberger, we were talking about this recently. And I think it's a wonderful image about how does doctrine, what's the formative role that doctrine plays? It's not to produce people who have a knowledge of doctrine, but it is to produce people who in their discipleship have good theological intuitions and instincts. So that's probably,
I think that's so important. I think if you're in your churches, oftentimes the person who someone comes to help them make meaning or to help them, interpret an event or to understand where God is in a moment is not always the first point of call, is the person who's at that end, who the church have charged the doctrine. It's you who just have been there the same amount of time or a little bit longer or maybe even less time in the church than them.
Yeah.
And it's not about having, the exact right, tick off every box, avoid every, minutiae of heresy answer, but it's having an answer that has exactly good insights and instincts that, helps people to understand an event well in light of the world we proclaim through the light of the gospel. And I think that there is exactly virtue in being able to have those instincts formed. So that's really great spot. Once again, Christian Doctrine, A Guide for the Perplexed. You can also check out Geoff's blog. I'll link it in the bio, and some great articles on there. And his other books, which particularly if you're a Uniting Church person, there's 3 good books I can know off the top of my head that would all be worthwhile your time.
Thank you.
Geoff, thanks for coming on.
Okay, thank you, Liam.